Hey, good morning, APUSHers. The purpose of this video is going to take a look at topic 713C. This is part 3 on the military aspects of World War II. This one we're going to take a look at the conclusion of the war, the victory that's associated with the Allies at the end of World War II, but also the revelations and the horrors of World War II. A couple of heavy topics coming up in here, but let's see if we can get to it. So when we left off talking about the European theater of war, we were talking about the D-Day invasion and the advance through France, the liberation of France, the Battle of the Bulge, and then the front line of the war extending into Germany. Prior to that, there had been an increasing use of bombing missions into German cities to try to soften up the infrastructure, to try to break the will of the German people, to keep dedication to the war effort. This started as early as 1942, but it increased in its intensity through 1943 and 44 and into 1945. This is done really as a response to what the Nazis were doing in the bombing missions during the Battle of Britain. And at that point, back in 1940, the idea from the Allies was that we would never do any kind of targeting of civilians along those lines. But the truth is, by the time you get to 1944, civilian casualties and civilian deaths as a result of World War II is just a matter of reality that's being pursued not just by the Nazis and the Axis powers, but also by the United States and the Allies, that there's a certain level of consequence that is going to happen for civilian populations. So the city of Würzburg here is nothing unique compared to other German cities, where the bombing missions in these cities are so intense that it leads to firestorms that completely gut sections of cities, and there's going to be tens of thousands of deaths associated with this, with each bombing run into these different cities. And so this is an extremely horrific part of the war, but it's something that kind of builds up slowly over time through the course of 4 years of American involvement. By the time you get to the end of 1944, in this presidential election, this is the re-election of President Roosevelt for his 4th term. He was first elected back in 1932. This is his 4th election as president, but this is his last term as president. Harry Truman is his running mate here. He's a new vice president for President Roosevelt. And as you may remember from the Homefront video in class, this is definitely some foreshadowing for the importance of the role that Truman's going to play later on. By February 1945, the big three for World War II. That is in this very nice color photo. That's Roosevelt there in the middle, and you can see Winston Churchill on the left and Joseph Stalin on the right. These three men meet at Yalta. This is a coastal town on the Black Sea. It is their last discussions for plans regarding the aftermath of the war, where they conclude that they're going to require unconditional surrender from Germany. No negotiated treaty. They're basically going to require the Nazis to turn control of state over to these occupying forces at the conclusion of the war. Also decided here is the idea that the Soviet Union will declare war on Japan within a few months. I think it's within 3 months of the conclusion of the war in Europe. And it is true. The Soviet Union was not at war with Japan because their fight was only against Germany because the Nazis invaded Soviet Union in 1941. This is the last time that these big three will meet, and it is kind of a sign that there is definitely a belief that the war is going to end soon. 2 months later, in April 1945, this is like the big turn at the conclusion of the war. On April 12th, President Roosevelt dies after 12 years in office, and hundreds of thousands of Americans not really having a working memory of any other president there. When Roosevelt dies, this is a huge transition for the country in many, many ways. A little bit more than 2 weeks later, as Allied troops are moving into Berlin, Adolf Hitler and other top Nazi officials, they follow through on a suicide pact. And so at the end of April 1945, the Nazi regime has turned hands over from Hitler to a new generation of Nazi leadership. And that Nazi leadership does not have an interest in continuing the war any further, because they see the conclusion of the war as being only more death and more destruction for Germans, not just for Nazis, but for Germans. So then on May 7th, 1945, Germany surrenders, and this is referred to as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and this is seen as a huge celebration of sorts. That at this point, while the war is not over across on the Pacific side of things, the war is over here in the Atlantic, and so this is ready to move on to into the next, hopefully final phase of this. Over in the Pacific, the Battle of Okinawa is still taking place on May 7th, 1945, and so there is still work to be done. But here in Europe, it's the revelations of what happens next, or what has been happening inside of Nazi Germany. This truth is going to be difficult for Americans to figure out how to deal with. So, as Allied troops, whether they're American, British, French, or Russian, as they move into parts of Germany and parts of German occupied territories, they come across the concentration camps, the Nazi death camps that were put in place as a result of their Holocaust policies that they had in place, where, at least on the initial surface level of things, this seems like it is a prison work camp situation, similar to what you've seen from other prison camps in previous military conflicts. But the reality here is that these concentration camps are specifically to institute the murder of millions of people. 6 million Jews, and approximately 6 million other undesirables under the Nazi umbrella of how the world should work. This is all kind of a huge revelation to the bulk of the American public at this point, because while there were rumors about this, the true scope of this of these evil works isn't really felt until the end of the war in 1945. There's no real appropriate way I can sort of lay out for you the impact that this is going to have and the horrors that are associated with this. So I'm going to try to keep this in just a very much a United States history perspective, because the Holocaust is a end product of a completely state-sponsored level of racism and white supremacy, the type of thing that has been debated and argued in parts of the United States for the last several generations. And I believe that as a result of the liberation of the Nazi camps, that there is a conclusion that is drawn that something needs to change in the future for the United States. If you think back to other sections of these notes, we talked about the diversity of Americans, as how that was a benefit and an asset towards the Allied victory on this. Well, here you see the opposite end of this, where the Nazi policies that stood for oppression and fascism and a restriction of freedom and rights, what happens when that goes unchecked? And this is going to have a real serious consequence in the United States, as the civil rights movement is going to start to gain traction by the late 1940s into the 1950s. That is more of a topic for Unit 8. But we've got one other part of this war to conclude here in Unit 7 first. In the Pacific, the last time we talked about the war in the Pacific, it was the battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the last phase of the island hopping campaign, and we were talking about the next phase of the U.S. military strategy was the invasion of Japan. Well, now that we've got the conclusion of the war in Europe, we have a new big three that are making plans for this. Potsdam, Germany is a suburb of Berlin, and this represents the first meeting of the next big three. Joseph Stalin is there on the right. That's Harry S. Truman, United States President, there in the center. And the fella on the left that's sitting there, that is Clement Attlee. He is the new British Prime Minister. So no Winston Churchill, no Franklin Roosevelt. It's just this. During this conference, Wilson, how about President Truman gets a coded message that is going to let him know that there has been a successful test of the atomic bomb over in the deserts of New Mexico. And so this is the first time that there's going to be a real conversation between the American president and their allies over the development of the atomic bomb project and the Manhattan Project, so far as it's termed. This is the most expensive part of World War II. The United States government spends a couple of $billions to, pursue the development of the atomic bomb, and it is done in such level of secrecy that the majority of men and women that were working in labs for this project were not really given security clearance to know what the ultimate goal of the project was going to be. When Truman hears of this successful test, he turns to Joseph Stalin and asks, if there is a way to use a new weapon to help end this war, would you do it? And Stalin said, of course he would. But what Stalin really wasn't aware was the sheer size and scope of this new weapon. The successful test for the atomic bomb is called the Trinity test, and it is the most powerful explosion in the history of man. The power of the Trinity test explosion in New Mexico in 1945 is more powerful than every explosion by any piece of explosive, all pieces of explosive combined for the history of all mankind. The time lapse, we're going to see if this is going to work for us here. The transition on these photos is kind of showing just like the first tenth of a second of this entire explosion taking place. And while this is going to be seen as a weapon that can be used to end this war and end this quickly, it is really just the next step of the process of like the bombing missions that are being used in the war effort at all. The bombing plans and bombing strategies that's been taking place in Germany have also been taking place in cities in Japan. Firebombing missions into Tokyo had killed upwards of 125,000 people in recent months. And so this is, on the one hand, very similar to that, but on the other hand, those bombing missions that killed that many people, those were thousands and thousands of bombs. This is one. So actually, it's two. One at the city of Hiroshima and one at the city of Nagasaki, a couple of southern cities that were seen as being industrial centers, and so that's the reason they were selected as targets. But for each one of these, when the bomb is dropped, each one killed in the neighborhood of 60,000 people instantly, destroying the bulk of the structures in the entire city. And for each one of these, because of the radioactive fallout as a result of it, estimates are another 150 to 200,000 people are going to die from radiation-related illness over the course of the next several months. And so the fact this is happening just from two bombs, this is really seen as a justifiable tool to end the war, in the context of the killing of civilians has become increasingly acceptable during World War II, but it's not really going to be seen as acceptable at any point after this. The questions of, two pictures here. This is from the bomber sites over the city of Hiroshima before the bomb drops, and a subsequent flight in the next couple of days. A photo from the same spot is going to show us that the majority of the structures are just completely wiped away. The amount of death and the amount of destruction from one bomb, in this case, two bombs total, is just, it does not make sense to very many people. There are questions about the morality of using this. these weapons. It's the only time that, atomic weapons have ever been used in a state of war. And I hope it stays that way for the rest of my lifetime, because the fear that this creates is going to be felt not just here in Japan in 1945, but this fear of atomic weapons and nuclear weapons. It's a fear that's going to be felt really for the next several decades. In a World War II context, the Empire of Japan officially surrenders on August 14th, 1945. And at this point, this does represent the complete closure of everything with World War II. But because of the use of atomic weapons and the questions that they're starting to get raised between World War II allies in the United States and the Soviet Union, the era of the Cold War is ready to begin. And that is like a major topic for Unit 8 as we push forward into the next unit. But there's one more element of World War II that we need to make sure we are at least briefly taking a look at. Because the College Board points out for us that in post-World War II diplomacy, this is really about the emergence of the United States. The United States is going to emerge as the dominant power in the world, because all across Europe and all across Asia, the other major military powers, military industrial powers in the world, suffered mightily because of the war that was being fought in their territories. There is no major military conflict that takes place in the United States, so the United States comes out of World War II in a very, relatively speaking, comfortable economic military industrial situation. This is going to lead to the United States having a dominant role, not just in the Allied victory, but also in the post-war peace settlements. More on that when we get into Unit 8. And this represents a complete break from the earlier traditions from non-involvement in worldwide affairs. The debates in World War I, the debates going into World War II, whether or not the United States should even bother being involved in these global conflicts, those questions really don't exist once you get past 1945 into this new Cold War era for the United States and going into our modern world here in the 21st century. Thanks for listening.